My name is Amelie Reed, and on my 27th birthday, I was promoted to captain in the United States Army. I thought it was a new beginning. But at the ceremony, surrounded by the congratulations of my comrades, my mother's voice cut through the air like a knife. Honestly, we wish you'd never been born. The entire room fell silent. Those words condensed 27 years of feeling like a disappointment into a single, shattering moment. My father nodded in agreement, while my brother Bryce smirked. Her career is just government-funded charity. My entire world collapsed in the one place I thought I was safest. They were used to me taking it in silence, but this time, the soldier inside me took over. They had no idea they'd just ignited a war they were in no way prepared to fight. Before you hear the rest of my story, let me know what time it is where you are in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever been made to feel small by your own family while you were trying to rise. This story is for all of us. The silence that followed my mother's words wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the air in the Fort Bragg Officers Club. The cheerful clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the proud laughter. It all ceased to exist. It was as if the world had suddenly lost its sound, and all that remained was the high-pitched ringing in my ears. I felt the air get sucked from my lungs, leaving a hollow, aching cavity where my heart should have been. My dress uniform, moments before a source of immense pride, suddenly felt like a cage. 5 seconds. That's all it took. 5 seconds for my world to shrink to the polished wooden floor, the scent of stale bourbon, and the cold, absolute certainty of my own solitude. I could see the room through a sudden, strange haze. I saw the confused face of my commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, his brows furrowed in disbelief. I saw the embarrassed, shifting eyes of my fellow officers, their gazes darting away as if my humiliation were contagious. And I saw my father, Senator Gerald Reed, refusing to meet my eyes, his attention suddenly fixated on an invisible speck of dust on his expensive Italian leather shoes. It was a familiar act of cowardice, one I had witnessed 1,000 times before. I risked a glance at my best friend, Captain Eva Rostova. She was standing ramrod straight, her knuckles white as she clenched her fists at her sides. Her fury was a silent testament to our bond. But as her eyes met mine, I saw something else flicker beneath the anger. A sliver of pity. And in that moment, the pity hurt more than the hatred. Pity feels a lot like being looked down upon. A confirmation that you are, in fact, a pathetic creature to be looked after. The shame burned hotter than any anger could. In that 5-second eternity, I was no longer Captain Amelie Reed, a respected officer in the U.S. Army. I was just an unwanted child, a mistake. Then, just as my mother's smile widened, triumphant in her kill, I caught a whisper from the side. It was my brother, Trevor. His voice a venomous hiss meant only for my father's ear. "Just let her make a scene, Senator," he murmured, the lawyer in him already calculating. "The more dramatic it is, the easier it will be to prove she's psychologically unstable later." And that was it. The revelation that this wasn't just casual cruelty, it was a calculated attack. But they had miscalculated. They were expecting a daughter to break, a victim to cry. They forgot they were addressing a soldier. Deep within me, a switch flipped. It wasn't a conscious thought. It was the result of years of brutal, relentless training. My mind went quiet. The chaos receded, replaced by the cold, clear logic of my SEER instruction: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. I had been taught how to withstand psychological torture from the enemy. I just never imagined the enemy would share my blood. My breathing, which had been shallow and hitched, deepened into a steady, rhythmic cadence. My heart rate, which had been hammering against my ribs, slowed to a calm, deliberate beat. Tears were a luxury, a weakness I could not afford. They were an admission of defeat, and I was not defeated. I lifted my chin and looked directly at my mother, Barbara. But the eyes that met hers were not those of her wounded daughter. They were the eyes of an officer evaluating a threat. I saw a flicker of surprise, then frustration, cross her perfectly made-up face. She had expected a flood of tears, a public collapse. Instead, she was met with a wall of steel. She didn't know what to do with my silence. "Thank you," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion at all. The words hung in the dead air, sharp and clean. "Thank you for clarifying everyone's position." Then I initiated my counteroffensive. Ignoring my mother completely, I turned to face my father. My posture was perfect, my movements precise. "Senator Reed," I said, the formal title a deliberate strike, severing the final thread of our familial bond. Every officer in that room knew the power of addressing someone by their rank or title instead of their name. It creates distance. It asserts authority. My father flinched, his face paling. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "I require you to remove the rank you pinned on me," I stated. It was not a request. "Amelie, don't you dare make a scene," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with rage. I didn't even glance her way. My focus was locked on my father, my gaze unwavering. The room held its collective breath. For a U.S. senator to be dressed down by his own daughter, a captain, in a room full of military officers, it was unthinkable. He was trapped. "That's an order, sir," I said, my voice soft but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. His hand trembled as he raised it. With clumsy, fumbling fingers, he unfastened the pinback clasps of the silver bars on my shoulders. I felt the slight weight lift, first from my right shoulder, then my left. He wouldn't look at me, his eyes cast down in utter humiliation. He pressed the two small pieces of metal into my waiting palm. I looked down at the twin captain's bars, the silver stars cool and heavy against my skin. Then, with deliberate steps, I walked to the head table where a large sheet cake sat. In proud blue icing, it read, "Congratulations, Captain Reed." I carefully placed the bars on the table, right beside the cake. "An unwanted birthday gift," I announced, my voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Should be returned." I turned back to face them one last time, my mother, her face a mask of fury, my father, looking utterly broken. My brothers, their smirks finally gone, replaced by shock. "As of this moment, per your request," I said, meeting each of their gazes in turn, "I, Amelie Reed, cease to exist. Congratulations." Without another word, without a salute or a goodbye, I executed a perfect about-face. Shoulders back, head held high, I walked out of that room, leaving behind a stunned family and a chorus of whispers. I didn't look back. The soldier inside me was now in command, and my first order of business was to retreat, regroup, and prepare for the war they had just declared. The walk from the officers' club back to my off-base apartment was a blur. The cool North Carolina night air did nothing to extinguish the fire in my veins. The soldier in me had executed the mission, a tactical withdrawal under extreme duress. But the moment I closed and locked the door to my apartment, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving a chilling void in its wake. I didn't allow myself time to collapse. I didn't permit a single tear. To grieve would be to acknowledge a loss, and I couldn't lose something I never truly had. Instead, I launched Operation Eradication. My movements were methodical, precise. I opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. My mother, father, Bryce, Trevor, each one blocked on every social media platform. Their digital ghosts vanished with a series of clicks. Next, their phone numbers, blocked. Their email addresses, blocked. I then composed a short, sterile email to the Reed family's attorney in D.C. It read, "This email serves as official notice, effective immediately. I, Amelie Reed, am severing all contact with the Reed family. Any attempts to contact me will be considered harassment." I hit send before I could second-guess it. The final act was the hardest. In the back of my closet, beneath a stack of old Army field manuals, was a small oak box. It held the few carefully curated mementos of my childhood. I lifted the lid. Inside were photographs. Christmas at the senator's residence, forced smiles under a ridiculously large tree. A family vacation to Martha's Vineyard, me standing awkwardly at the edge of the frame. My high school graduation, my parents looking bored. One by one, I took them out. My hands were steady. There was no rage, no violent tearing. This wasn't an act of anger. It was a surgical procedure. I was a combat medic triaging a wound, cutting away the dead, infected tissue to save the patient. And the patient was me. I calmly tore each photo into small, unrecognizable pieces and let them fall into the kitchen trash can like confetti at a funeral. I was excising the toxic tumor that had been poisoning my life for 27 years. Just as the last piece of a smiling family portrait fluttered into the bin, my phone rang. The screen displayed a local Fayetteville number I knew as well as my own. My grandmother, Dorothy. I took a deep, steadying breath. The first one that felt like it reached the bottom of my lungs all day, and answered. "I heard," she said. There was no surprise in her voice, just a profound bone-deep weariness and the unshakable resolve of a true army wife. "Get over here now, soldier. I've got chicken soup on the stove and a bottle of bourbon waiting for you." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a question. It was a command, wrapped in love. And with that simple order, the steel wall inside me finally cracked. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. I swiped it away angrily. "Yes, ma'am," I whispered, my voice thick. "On my way." My grandmother's house was a small, cozy brick rancher nestled in a quiet Fayetteville neighborhood, a world away from the cold, ostentatious mansions of my D.C. upbringing. Her home was a museum of a different kind of legacy. Instead of photos with presidents and foreign dignitaries, her walls were adorned with my grandfather's military career. His framed medals, a shadow box with his unit patches, a black and white photo of him as a young first lieutenant in Korea. As I sat at her worn oak kitchen table, nursing a generous pour of bourbon, the dam finally broke. The memories, the ones I had suppressed for years, came flooding back. It wasn't just one event, it was a lifetime of 1,000 tiny cuts. I remembered the dinner after my high school graduation. I had just been awarded a full scholarship to West Point, a monumental achievement. My brothers, Trevor and Bryce, were already being praised for their early acceptance into Ivy League law and business schools. When the conversation turned to me, my father, Senator Reed, simply raised his glass of wine and said, "Well, at least the family saves on tuition." There was no "congratulations," no "I'm proud of you." My life's dream was reduced to a line item on his budget. I remembered my mother's reaction when I told her I was being deployed to Afghanistan. She looked at me with cold disappointment. "Just don't do anything stupid and get yourself killed in some godforsaken desert," she'd said. Imagine the embarrassment for the family. They never saw my service as a sacrifice. They saw it as a shameful rebellion, a deliberate choice to reject their world of power and wealth for one of dirt and duty. My medals for marksmanship, my commendations for leadership, they were dismissed as childish trinkets compared to my brother's stock portfolios and legal victories. My grandmother listened patiently, her expression unreadable, occasionally nodding as she stirred the soup. She'd heard versions of this story my whole life. When I finally fell silent, the bourbon warming my chest, she didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she stood up and walked over to a glass curio cabinet in the living room. From the top shelf, she retrieved a worn, velvet-covered box. She brought it back to the table and opened it. Inside, nestled on faded silk, lay my grandfather's purple heart and his silver star. "This," she said, her voice firm as she pushed the box into my hands, "is what this family is really about. Not expensive suits or fancy DC law offices. This." Her finger tapped the glass above the silver star. "Courage, sacrifice, honor." She looked me straight in the eye. "Your mother has forgotten that. She was so desperate to marry into power that she forgot where she came from. She forgot the daughter of a hero to become the wife of a politician." Her gaze softened. "She even tore up your West Point application, you know. I found it in the trash, taped it back together, and mailed it myself." The confession hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I thought I had defied them on my own. I never knew I had a silent ally, a force working in the shadows on my behalf. Before I left that night, I remembered something one of my instructors at West Point, a female colonel, had told our class of cadets. "They can attack your rank," she had said, her voice like granite. "They can attack your career. But you never, ever let them attack your honor." That is the only thing you truly own. My grandmother placed her hand over mine, her touch warm and steady. You, Emily, she said, her voice thick with a pride I had starved for my entire life, are his true legacy. I looked down at the medals, their metallic sheen glowing under the soft kitchen light. Then I looked at my grandmother, the steadfast matriarch of a forgotten dynasty of honor. For the first time in hours, a flicker of hope ignited in the cold darkness of my heart. This war, I realized, was not mine to fight alone. The next morning, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I woke up feeling something akin to peace. I had spent the night at my grandmother's house, sleeping in the small guest room that had once been my mother's. Surrounded by the faint scent of cedar and lavender, I felt protected. Dorothy's unwavering support was a shield, a piece of armor I hadn't realized I was missing. I drove back to Fort Bragg with a renewed sense of purpose. My personal war had been declared, but my professional life, my real life, was here. This was my sanctuary, my fortress. The U.S. Army didn't care about my family's drama. It cared about performance, duty, and honor. And on those metrics, I was unimpeachable. I would pour myself into my work, into my soldiers, and I would prove my worth through action, not words. When I walked into my office, Captain Eva Rostova was already there, a steaming mug of black coffee waiting on my desk. She didn't say much, just gave me a solid, appraising look. "I'm with you," she said, her voice low and steady. It was all she needed to say. In the Army, you learn that camaraderie isn't about grand speeches. It's about the quiet presence of someone who has your back, no questions asked. That simple gesture, that cup of coffee, meant more to me than any hollow apology from my family ever could. For a few hours, things felt normal. I reviewed training schedules, signed off on supply requisitions, and prepared my briefs. I was Captain Reed again, in my element, in control. But the peace was a fragile ceasefire, not a lasting treaty. Just before noon, an email popped into my inbox. The subject line was capitalized, stark, and ominous. Urgent. It was from the battalion commander's office. The body of the message was brief and chillingly formal. Captain Reed, be in my office at 14 hours. My heart seized. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews was a tough but fair commander. He was an old-school infantryman who usually communicated with a gruff, "Hey, Reed, get in here." This cold, formal language was reserved for official reprimands and serious business. This was not a conversation. This was a summons. Eva saw the color drain from my face. "What is it?" I turned the screen toward her. She read the email, and her own expression hardened. "They started," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that this was the consequence my mother had implicitly threatened. The war had just crossed the perimeter of my fortress. At precisely 14, I stood before Lieutenant Colonel Matthews' desk, my back straight, my hands clasped behind me. The air in his office was thick and heavy, like the oppressive humidity before a thunderstorm. He looked tired, older than he had just a day before, and he didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I've just received a directive from the Base Inspector General's office," he said, his voice flat. He pushed a manila folder across his polished mahogany desk. It slid to a stop in front of me. "Anonymous letters have been sent, expressing grave concerns about your psychological stability and command fitness following the incident at your promotion ceremony." My blood ran cold as I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the typed pages, each word a carefully crafted piece of shrapnel. They didn't use overtly false claims. Instead, they twisted the truth with surgical precision. My decisive actions at the ceremony were painted as an unstable emotional outburst. My severing of contact was described as erratic and paranoid behavior. They were building a narrative, brick by insidious brick, of an officer on the verge of a breakdown. A liability to her unit, a danger to the soldiers under her command. But the most venomous part was a single, devastating paragraph. It accused me of unprofessional conduct, alleging a pattern of favoritism toward male soldiers and inappropriate, dismissive behavior toward the females in my platoon. It was a cowardly, brilliant strike. In the modern military, it was a career-killing accusation, a poison that tainted everything, almost impossible to disprove. It was an attack aimed directly at my integrity as a female leader. I looked up from the pages, my hands steady despite the fury raging inside me. I thought of the soldier's creed, a promise I had lived by every single day of my career. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Right now, the fallen comrade was my own honor, my own career, and I had to be the one to save it. I know this is bullshit, Reed, LTC Matthews said, breaking the silence. The frustration in his voice was palpable. Your file is spotless. Your evaluations are stellar. You are one of the best young officers I have. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. But I can't ignore a formal complaint, especially not when it comes with a strong recommendation for review from certain high-level offices in D.C. He didn't have to say my father's name. We both knew the senator's reach was long. I believe you, Reed. But the Inspector General believes in paperwork, and someone with a great deal of power has made sure this paperwork looks very, very credible. The verdict came, swift and brutal. Your appointment as company commander is on hold, pending investigation, he said, each word a hammer blow. You're being placed on a period of command observation. Every decision you make, every order you give, will be under a microscope. One slip-up, one minor mistake, and your career in this battalion is over. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. They want you to fail, Captain. They are betting on you to break. He stood up and walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of me, a commander speaking to his soldier. Don't give them what they want. His eyes were hard as flint. Prove them wrong, Captain. I snapped to attention. Hoo-ah, I said, my voice clear and unwavering. As I walked out of his office, the fortress of my career no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield. And I was surrounded. Accepting Lieutenant Colonel Matthews's challenge was like receiving a new mission order. The grief and shock were compartmentalized. The objective was clear: prove them wrong. Survival depended on it. That evening, Eva and I transformed my small apartment into a command center. We didn't talk about feelings, we talked strategy. With the precision of staff officers planning an operation, we worked the phones. We collected sworn, notarized statements from every officer and enlisted soldier who had witnessed the events at the ceremony. We compiled a detailed dossier, complete with character references and a point-by-point rebuttal of every slanderous accusation. I worked with cold, detached efficiency, channeling all my pain into the meticulous organization of facts. I was fighting for my reputation, my career, and my honor. And I would win this battle with the undeniable truth. By midnight, a comprehensive counterfile was emailed to LTC Matthews. Phase 1 was complete. I felt a sliver of control returning. That feeling lasted until I returned to my apartment after a grueling day of being observed on base. Taped to my front door was a stark white piece of paper, an official notice. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, but 3 words jumped out. Notice to vacate. The fine print gave me 72 hours to remove all my belongings. My heart plummeted. I fumbled for my phone and dialed my landlord, Mr. Henderson, an elderly veteran who had always treated me with kindness. He answered on the second ring, his voice strained and apologetic. Captain Reed, I'm so sorry, he stammered. I got a call. From your previous landlord. Said you were a disruptive tenant, loud parties, constant disturbances. My lease agreement has a clause. I stood there, speechless, the phone pressed hard against my ear. A previous landlord? I had moved here straight from the barracks. I'd never had a previous landlord in my life. It was a blatant, malicious lie, delivered with enough authority to scare a decent old man into evicting a soldier. My family hadn't just breached the fortress of my career, they had just blown up my home. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. With a 72-hour deadline hanging over my head, I sat in my car and tried to book a cheap motel room for a week, just to have a place to land. My credit card was declined. I tried again. Declined. I switched to my debit card. Declined. Confused and increasingly frantic, I opened my banking app. My breath hitched in my throat. The screen displayed my checking and savings account balances in glaring red. 0.00. Beneath the zero was a single, terrifying line of text. Account frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. Every dollar I'd ever saved, my entire salary, was gone. Wiped out. A quick check of my wallet revealed $43 in cash and some loose change. In the span of a few hours, I had gone from a U.S. Army captain with a spotless record to a woman on the verge of being homeless and completely broke. I called the bank's fraud department, my voice shaking. A sympathetic-sounding woman put me on hold. When she came back, her tone was cautious. "Captain Reed, I see the report here. Your account was flagged for fraud and a request to freeze was submitted. Can you verify your location?" "I'm in Fayetteville, North Carolina," I said, confused. There was a pause and the sound of typing. "That's what I thought," she said, her voice dropping. "Ma'am, I'm probably not supposed to tell you this, but the IP address that filed the fraud report originated from the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The line went silent. She didn't need to say anything else. It was my father. He had used the power of his office to financially cripple his own daughter. I spent that night in my car, a beat-up old Honda Civic, parked in the far corner of a 24-hour Walmart parking lot. I reclined the driver's seat, the fabric smelling faintly of old coffee, and stared up at the sickly yellow glow of the parking lot lights. At around 2 a.m., a sharp rap on my window made me jump. A portly security guard shone a flashlight in my face. I had to show him my military ID, my face burning with shame, and explain that I wasn't a vagrant, that I was a captain, that I just had nowhere else to go. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. As I sat there in the pre-dawn chill, utterly alone and stripped of everything, I thought of the stories of General Washington at Valley Forge. His army, starving, freezing, and in rags, held on through a brutal winter. They didn't quit. This was my Valley Forge. I had to survive this winter. Just as the first rays of sun began to pierce the darkness, my phone buzzed. It was my brother, Trevor. I almost didn't answer, but some morbid curiosity made me press the screen. His voice was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with satisfaction. "See, little sister, it can always get worse. Mom and Dad just want you to learn a little humility. Be a good girl, drive up to D.C., get on your knees, and apologize. Tell them you're sorry for being such a disappointment. All of this," he chuckled. "It will all disappear. Like it never happened." The condescension, the absolute certainty in his voice that he had won, that I was broken, ignited something in me. The despair that had been choking me for hours caught fire, burning away the fear and leaving behind a cold, hard rage. I took a slow, deliberate breath. If you are listening to this and you believe that family should be a safe harbor, not the storm that sinks your ship, please support me by hitting the like button and typing "You are not alone" in the comments below. Because in that moment, hearing your support is what I needed most. Then I brought the phone back to my ear. "Tell them," I said, my voice quiet but each word forged in ice, "that I would rather be court-martialed and starve to death on the street than ever have to look at their faces again." I hung up. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. This was no longer a battle. This was a war of annihilation. A few days after my final defiant phone call with Trevor, the killing blow landed. The summons this time wasn't to my battalion commander's office. It was to brigade headquarters. The moment I stepped inside the colonel's office, I knew this was different. The sympathetic frustration I had seen in LTC Matthews's eyes was gone, replaced by the cold, impartial mask of military justice. There was no preamble. A formal charge had been filed against me under Article 133 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Conduct unbecoming an officer. It was a charge that could end a career, strip a soldier of their rank, benefits, and honor in one fell swoop. The evidence was laid out on the table. It was a series of anonymous emails sent to the command, But the centerpiece of the accusation was a chain of forged communications. They were presented as PDFs, perfect replicas of internal Army emails between myself and one of my sergeants from my tour in Afghanistan. The emails detailed a conspiracy where I allegedly falsified an after-action report to cover up the loss of a multi-thousand-dollar piece of night vision equipment. As I stared at the forged documents, I felt a sickening sense of recognition. This had my brother Bryce's fingerprints all over it. His tech genius twisted into something monstrous. The emails were horrifyingly convincing. They even included a few of my common typos and a nickname I used for my sergeant, Sarge. It showed a level of meticulous, cruel observation that turned my stomach. This wasn't just an attack. It was a character assassination designed to destroy the very core of my identity, my honor as an officer. The consequences were immediate and brutal. An official AR-15-6 investigation was launched. I was suspended from all duties, effective immediately. In a sterile, humiliating procedure, I was escorted to my office to turn in my sidearm, my keys, and my common access card. In the eyes of the Army I'd sworn to serve, I was no longer a trusted leader. I was a suspect. News travels fast on a military base. As I was escorted off post, I felt the stares. I heard the whispers, the curious glances, the sudden silences as I walked by. It was like I was wearing an invisible scarlet letter. I was no longer just Amelie Reed. I was that captain, the one under investigation. I had no home, no money, and now, no honor. That night, I just drove. I had no destination. The neat, orderly streets of Fayetteville blurred into a meaningless sprawl. My beat-up Honda Civic was my only possession, my only shelter. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of a small, quiet church on the outskirts of town. I wasn't religious. I wasn't looking for God. I was just looking for a place where the silence was deeper than the noise in my own head. I slipped inside and sat in the last pew, enveloped by the cool, dark stillness. And there, in the silent witness of the empty pews, I finally let myself break. The soldier, the captain, the fighter. She was gone. All that was left was a girl who had lost everything. The sobs that racked my body were silent, guttural things, the soundless screams of a person who had been utterly and completely betrayed. They didn't just want me to fail. They wanted to erase me from existence, to turn my name into a cautionary tale, a stain on the history of my unit. And in that moment, in the dark of that anonymous church, I felt like they had won. Just as I was about to be completely consumed by the despair, a gentle hand landed on my shoulder. I flinched, looking up through blurry eyes. It was Eva, and standing right behind her, my grandmother, Dorothy. Eva had tracked my phone. "Knew I'd find you here," my grandmother said softly, her voice a comforting anchor in the storm. "Come on, soldier. The battle's not over yet." They didn't ask questions. They didn't demand explanations. They simply flanked me like a presidential honor guard and led me out of the church and back to my grandmother's house. Eva immediately went to the kitchen and started making a pot of soup. My grandmother picked up the phone. "Carol, it's Dorothy," she said, her voice now sharp with purpose. "I've got something for you. Something important." They didn't let me drown in my misery. They pulled me from the water, wrapped me in a blanket, and began to prepare me for the fight to come. My grandmother hung up the phone and came over to where I was sitting, a hollowed-out shell on her sofa. She took my hand. "A woman is like a tea bag," she said, quoting Eleanor Roosevelt. "You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water." She squeezed my hand. "You, my dear, are in boiling water. It's time to show them how strong you are." The next morning, Carol Jensen was sitting in my grandmother's living room. She was a top civil attorney from Raleigh, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a shock of silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to the entire story, from my 27th birthday to the falsified emails, her expression unreadable. She examined every piece of paper, every timeline, with the focused intensity of a hawk. When I finished, she didn't offer sympathy. She didn't say, "I'm so sorry for what you've been through." She looked me dead in the eye, a cold, predatory smile touching the corners of her lips. "This is a targeted harassment campaign. she declared, her voice like ice. A textbook case of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Your JAG lawyer can handle the 15-6 investigation. They play by the Army's rules. She leaned forward, her eyes glinting. I, on the other hand, will handle the part where your family pays for every dollar they cost you, for every tear they made you cry, and for every second of sleep they made you lose. She tapped a manicured finger on the table for emphasis. We're going to sue them. With Carol Jensen's declaration of war, my fight for survival shifted. It was no longer a lone, desperate defense. It was now a coordinated, two-front counteroffensive. On the military front, my JAG-appointed lawyer, a sharp young captain, began dismantling the case against me. The tide truly began to turn with the arrival of Major Hayes, my old company commander from Afghanistan. He was a salt-of-the-earth infantryman from rural Colorado, a man whose integrity was as solid as the Rocky Mountains. When he heard what was happening, he bought a plane ticket with his own money and flew to Fort Bragg without a moment's hesitation. I will not stand by and let one of my best officers be destroyed by lies, he stated bluntly to the investigators. Captain Reed's honor is a reflection of our unit's honor, and I'm here to defend it. His unwavering testimony, combined with the Army's own cyber forensics team finding digital fingerprints on the forged emails that proved they couldn't have originated from any of my devices, began to poke serious holes in the prosecution's narrative. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope for my career. Meanwhile, on the civilian front, Carol Jensen and her private investigator began their own deep dive. They weren't looking for character flaws, they were following the money. Carol's strategy was simple. When a powerful family acts this irrationally, the motive is almost always desperation. My own story, that of a lifelong disappointment, didn't quite fit the sheer viciousness of their attack. Carol was looking for the real reason. In the midst of this tense, nerve-wracking waiting game, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother. Our relationship had always been distant. In the Reed family hierarchy, Frank was the forgotten one. A quiet, unassuming CPA from Baltimore, completely overshadowed by his powerful senator brother. Amelie, he said, his voice urgent and low. I need to see you. Alone. It's important. It's about why they're doing this to you. We met at an old-school diner off a forgotten highway between Fayetteville and Raleigh. It was the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox playing classic rock, and the comforting smell of coffee and bacon grease hanging in the air. Public, yet anonymous. Uncle Frank looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He slid a thick file folder across the sticky tabletop. Your parents, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. They're broke, Amelie. Completely bankrupt. I stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? They're the Reeds. They're untouchable. It's a house of cards, he said, shaking his head. Bad investments, a lifestyle they couldn't sustain, propping up your brother's failed business ventures. It's all gone. They're millions of dollars in debt. The senator's reputation is the only thing keeping the creditors at bay. He had discovered the truth accidentally while handling a small piece of their tax filings, a task they had thrown his way like a scrap from the table. My mind was reeling. But what does that have to do with me? Why do all of this? Frank took a deep breath and slid another document out of the folder. It was a photocopy of a legal document. My grandmother Dorothy's last will and testament. Because of this, he said, tapping a paragraph with his finger. My eyes scanned the words. My grandmother, in her infinite wisdom and foresight, had structured her will to bypass her own daughter. My mother, Barbara, was to receive 20% of her considerable estate. My brothers were to receive small trusts. But 50%, half of everything, was left directly to me. They can't touch your grandmother's money while she's alive, Frank explained, his voice heavy with disgust. Their plan? It was to destroy you, to ruin your career, break you mentally, make you so destitute that you'd have to come crawling back to them. They wanted to have you declared mentally incompetent, make themselves your legal guardians, and gain control of your inheritance the moment your grandmother passes. I just sat there, staring at the numbers on the page. The clatter of plates and the low hum of the diner faded into nothing. And suddenly, everything made a horrible, perfect sense. The public humiliation, the escalation, the attacks on my home, my finances, my honor. It was never about me being a disappointment. It was never about my choices. It was because I was a multi-million-dollar life raft and they were drowning. The pain of that betrayal was immense, a deep, crushing weight. But underneath it, something else stirred. It was the sound of a 27-year-old chain shattering. The suffocating burden of, "I'm not good enough," the voice that had whispered in my ear my entire life, finally went silent. I wasn't the problem. Their greed was the problem. The anger inside me was no longer a wild, desperate rage. It transformed. It became a cold, focused flame. I felt like the Aaron Brockovich of my own life story. A regular person who had just been handed the key piece of evidence to bring down a powerful, corrupt entity. Have you ever had a moment where everything suddenly clicked and you finally understood the real reason behind someone's cruelty? If you have, please hit the like button and just type "the truth" in the comments. It's a moment of clarity that changes everything. I looked up from the documents and met my uncle's worried eyes. The quiet accountant, the family afterthought, had just done the bravest thing I'd ever witnessed. "Thank you, Uncle Frank," I said, and my voice was the calm, steady voice of a soldier again. "You just handed me the silver bullet I needed." I gathered the papers, my hands no longer shaking. I left the diner with a new mission objective. This was no longer just about defense. It was time to bring the truth to light. I pulled out my phone and dialed Carol Jensen's number. When she answered, I didn't waste time. "I've got it, Carol," I said. "I've got the motive." I could almost hear her smile through the phone. I took a deep breath and asked the question that would set the next phase of the war in motion. "So what do we do now?" Carol Jensen didn't believe in defensive warfare. Inspired by General Ulysses S. Grant's philosophy of total war, her strategy was one of relentless, overwhelming assault on all fronts. With the truth as our weapon, we launched Operation Thunderbolt. The Reed family fired the first shot after learning I'd retained counsel. It was a vicious, preemptive strike. They filed a petition for conservatorship over my grandmother Dorothy, claiming she was senile and being unduly influenced by a disturbed granddaughter to steal the family fortune. They walked into the preliminary hearing with the smug confidence of people who had never lost. But they had severely underestimated Carol Jensen. She was prepared. She not only presented a recent, comprehensive psychological evaluation declaring Dorothy to be of perfectly sound mind, but she also introduced the financial documents from Uncle Frank. She painted a clear picture for the judge. This wasn't about a concerned family protecting their matriarch. This was about a bankrupt son and daughter-in-law making a desperate grab for money. The judge dismissed their petition with a stern warning to my mother about committing perjury. The Reeds left the courtroom looking stunned, their first assault easily repelled. Their wall of steel had just shown its first crack. The main event was the hearing for the permanent restraining order I'd filed against them. My family arrived in force, a united front of tailored suits and arrogant smirks, with Trevor acting as their legal counsel. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. My mother, Barbara, took the stand first. She began her performance, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, her voice trembling as she spoke of her deep and abiding concern for her daughter's fragile mental health. "I just want my little girl back," she whispered, a perfect imitation of a heartbroken mother. Then it was Carol's turn to cross-examine. She approached the stand with a calm, almost serene demeanor. "Mrs. Reed," she began, her voice polite, "you've testified to your profound concern for your daughter. Could you please tell the court the last time you telephoned Captain Reed just to see how she was doing prior to the incident at her promotion?" Barbara froze. Her mind raced, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an answer that wasn't there. The silence stretched. 1 second. 3. 5. I can't recall the exact date," she finally stammered. "Perhaps I can help," Carol said, pulling out a file. "According to Captain Reed's phone records, it was 6.5 months ago. Does that sound correct?" My mother's face flushed a blotchy red. The mask was slipping. Trevor, seeing his star witness faltering, tried to regain control during his turn to question me. He strode confidently before the judge. "Captain Reed," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Isn't it true that you are currently suspended from your duties? That you are under a formal investigation? Doesn't that suggest a pattern of instability?" Before I could answer, Carol stood. "Objection. Counsel is mischaracterizing the situation." "I'll rephrase," Trevor said with a smirk. "Captain Reed, are you or are you not currently deemed unfit for command?" Following Carol's coaching, I met his gaze without flinching. "My suspension does not prove that I am unstable, Trevor," I said, my voice cold and clear. "It proves that a sitting United States Senator abused his power to launch a fraudulent investigation against a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. A fact that I am sure the Senate Select Committee on Ethics would be very interested in exploring." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Trevor's face went white. Beside him, my father looked like he had been physically struck. I had just turned their own weapon against them, transforming their attack on my career into a direct threat to his. But Carol saved her most devastating weapon for last. After presenting the bank reports tracing the fraud alert to the Senate building and the landlord's testimony about the anonymous call, she turned back to my mother. "One final question, Mrs. Reed," she said gently. "Are you aware that your daughter has a severe allergy to strawberries?" Barbara looked utterly baffled. I'm not sure." Carol turned to me. "Captain Reed, how severe is this allergy?" "Anaphylactic shock, ma'am," I replied. "It can be fatal." Carol faced the judge, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "Your Honor, we have a mother here who claims to be consumed with worry for her daughter's well-being, yet she is unaware of a basic medical fact that could kill her. That is not concern. That is negligence." And that's when the Queen finally lost her composure. "She's an ungrateful child," Barbara shrieked, jumping to her feet and pointing a trembling finger at me. "After everything we gave her, she should have known her place." The courtroom erupted. The carefully constructed facade of the concerned, loving family had been shattered, revealing the ugly, tyrannical truth beneath. The judge slammed his gavel down. "Order! Order! That's enough, Mrs. Reed." The permanent restraining order was granted. 500 yards. No phone calls, no emails, no contact of any kind, direct or indirect. The wall had crumbled. Facing the impending civil lawsuit for harassment, the threat of Trevor being disbarred, and the political time bomb I had just armed, the Reed family finally surrendered. Their lawyer contacted Carol with an offer of unconditional capitulation. They agreed to a settlement. They would pay all of my legal fees, provide a symbolic monetary compensation for damages, and sign a legally binding agreement to never, ever interfere in my life again. On the same day the settlement was finalized, I received an email from Army Command. The AR-15-6 investigation was closed. I had been fully and completely exonerated. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees. I had won. But as I read further down the email, a single sentence sent a chill down my spine. It was polite, bureaucratic, and utterly devastating. "In the interest of avoiding any future distractions, the command suggests that the captain consider a transfer to another duty station." I had won the battle, but it seemed I was still losing the war. I sat in the temporary furnished apartment my grandmother had rented for me, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the otherwise dark room. I read the email from the command for the 10th time. Exonerated. The word felt both monumental and hollow. I had won. My family was defeated, bound by law to stay away from me. My honor, in the eyes of the military justice system, was restored. But there was no triumphant celebration, no joyous release. There was only the bitter aftertaste of that final sentence. Consider a transfer to another duty station. It was polite, bureaucratic army speak, but the message was crystal clear. You are a problem, and we want the problem to go away. I had fought tooth and nail, exposed the corruption, and won on every single front, only to be told that I was the distraction. I was the one who had to leave. The sheer injustice of it settled in my bones, a deep and profound weariness. I had protected the integrity of the system, and in return, The system was quietly showing me the door. In that moment of quiet reflection, I picked up a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that I kept on my nightstand. My finger traced a passage I had underlined long ago. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The words of the Stoic emperor resonated deeply. I couldn't change the command's decision or the political calculations behind it, but I could control my response. It was then that I realized the bitter truth. Even with my name cleared, I would forever be marked here at Fort Bragg. I would be the officer who caused all that drama, the one whose family included a disgraced senator. I would never have a truly clean slate. The suggestion to transfer wasn't just a bureaucratic solution, it was a harsh but accurate assessment. To truly be reborn, I had to leave the ashes behind. As if on cue, my phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was an unknown number with a Washington state area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Captain Reed, a deep, authoritative voice inquired. Speaking, I replied, cautious. This is Colonel Miller, Joint Base Lewis McCord. Major Hayes is an old friend of mine. He told me your story. I held my breath, my heart suddenly pounding. Lewis McCord, on the other side of the country. Your record is exemplary, Captain, the colonel continued, his voice resonating with genuine respect. And your resilience. Well, that's even more impressive. I have a company here that's been through some rough leadership. They need a commander with a steel spine. The position is yours, if you want it. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the last few months suddenly feeling a little lighter. This wasn't a suggestion to disappear. This wasn't a consolation prize. This was a recruitment. It was an offer based not on the drama I had survived, but on the strength I had shown. It was a chance to start over, not as a victim, but as a sought-after leader. I looked out the window, toward the setting sun. North Carolina was my past, a battlefield I had conquered but was now leaving behind. The Pacific Northwest, Washington State. That was the future. A promised land. Colonel, I said, and my voice was filled with a confidence and energy I hadn't felt in months. I would be honored to accept. The decision was made. A tactical retreat was not a defeat. It was a strategic redeployment to a better battlefield. I immediately began the complex process of a permanent change of station, a PCS. My life was suddenly a whirlwind of checklists and paperwork, a familiar and comforting chaos. My grandmother Dorothy, beaming with undisguised pride, gave me what she called a logistical support package. It was a check for $50,000. So you have a solid start, she said, pressing it into my hand. Dependent on no one. My last week at Fort Bragg was a blur of goodbyes. The most poignant moment came unexpectedly. My old unit, the soldiers I'd been forced to leave behind, threw me a secret farewell barbecue at a local park. My former first sergeant, a gruff man who rarely showed emotion, presented me with an American flag that had flown over the base, its edges signed by every soldier in the company. Ma'am, he said, his voice thick, you taught us that the toughest battles are sometimes the ones fought right here at home. You're the kind of commander we'll tell stories about for years. Looking at the faces of my soldiers, seeing their respect and loyalty, I knew I had already won the only victory that truly mattered. On my final day, as I packed the last of my boxes, a small, unexpected package arrived by courier. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were the silver captain's bars my father had stripped from my shoulders. Tucked alongside them was a single, spiteful note scrawled in my mother's elegant handwriting. You think you've won, you little bitch? I looked at the bars, then at the note. I felt nothing. No pain, no anger. Just a profound sense of pity for a woman so consumed by her own bitterness that this was her final, pathetic shot. I calmly took the note and the silver bars and placed them in an old, empty box. I sealed it shut with a strip of packing tape. The past was now officially contained. I picked up a map of the United States and unfolded it on the floor, tracing the long road from Fayetteville, North Carolina, to Joint Base Lewis McCord, Washington. My eyes were fixed on the Pacific Northwest. A new front was waiting. life at Joint Base Lewis McChord, nestled in the lush, evergreen forests of Washington state, was more than a new beginning. It was a resurrection. The air here felt cleaner, the sky seemed bigger, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the space to simply breathe. I threw myself into my new command, and I thrived. The soldiers in my company, a gritty and capable unit that had been yearning for steady leadership, responded to my fairness and decisiveness. My past, once a source of crippling shame, had forged me into a better leader. I was more empathetic, more attuned to the morale of my troops, because I knew what it felt like to be at rock bottom. My life found a rhythm that was peaceful and fulfilling. I found a real family in the easy camaraderie of my fellow officers. We spent weekends hiking the majestic trails of Mount Rainier, the sheer scale of the landscape putting my old troubles into perspective. We had backyard barbecues that filled the cool summer evenings with the smell of grilled burgers and the sound of easy laughter. I was no longer just surviving, I was flourishing. I even started dating. Captain Mike Chen was an Apache helicopter pilot with a quick smile and a calm, steady presence that I found incredibly grounding. I never told him the full, sordid details of my past. I didn't need to. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset over the Puget Sound, he turned to me. "I don't care what battles you fought to get here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I just know that the soldier sitting in front of me is the strongest person I've ever met." In that moment, being seen for who I was, not for the wounds I carried, felt like the final piece of healing I never knew I needed. For 18 months, my life was a picture of peace, success, and genuine happiness. I had made it. I was safe. And then, one evening, a ghost from my past slipped through the digital fortress I'd so carefully constructed. An email, somehow bypassing every filter and firewall, appeared in my inbox. The sender was Trevor. The subject line was a single, chilling phrase. About Mom. My heart did a painful lurch. For a moment, I was tempted to delete it without reading, to vaporize it before its poison could touch my new life. But I couldn't. I clicked it open. The email was short, clinically so. It informed me that my mother, Barbara, had been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. The doctors had given her a few months, at best. The email ended with a final, manipulative twist. "The doctors say her state of mind is critical. Perhaps a word of forgiveness from you would be the best medicine." Just like that, the past I had buried was clawing its way out of the grave. A wave of old, conditioned responses washed over me. The guilt, the sense of duty, the deeply ingrained feeling that a child, no matter what, owes their parent a final goodbye. Could I live with myself if I refused a dying woman's last wish, even if that woman had tried to destroy me? The serene landscape of my new life was suddenly clouded by the fog of an old war. But the soldier I had become doesn't act on raw emotion. The first step in any operation is to gather intelligence. I put down my laptop, took a deep breath, and called the one source I knew I could trust. My grandmother Dorothy answered the phone. I explained the email, my voice more clinical than I felt. She let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "It's true, Amelie," she confirmed, her voice heavy. "She's sick, very sick." There was a pause. "But she hasn't changed. She's been pressuring me every day, telling me that if I don't change my will and write you out, she'll die without peace. She's using her illness as her last and final weapon." The truth, as harsh and ugly as it was also liberating. It was the intelligence I needed. This wasn't a genuine plea for reconciliation. It wasn't a deathbed repentance. It was one last, desperate attempt at manipulation. My mother wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was making a final play for the money. That brutal clarity solidified my resolve. My new mission, the one I had built my entire life around for the past 18 months, was to be a good leader, a good partner, and a happy, healthy person. Returning to that toxic battlefield would jeopardize that mission. And a good soldier never jeopardizes the mission. I sat down at my computer and began to compose a reply to Trevor. The words were formal, polite, and as unbreachable as a fortress wall. I expressed my sincere regret for his mother's diagnosis and wished her peace in her final days. I then stated, clearly and without apology, that my duties and my life were here in Washington with my soldiers. I would not be returning. I ended the email with a single, declarative sentence that was as much for me as it was for them. I have chosen my peace and my honor. I hit send. Then I went into my email settings, created a new filter, and permanently blocked all future correspondence from his address. Click. The last door to my past was closed, locked, and sealed forever. I had completed my final tactical withdrawal. I was, at long last, completely and utterly free. 3 years later. The air in the Eisenhower Auditorium at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, hummed with the quiet energy of the nation's best and brightest. I stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, my peers, the future leaders of the Army. And for the first time in my life, I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I belonged. I was Major Amelie Reed now. I wasn't just a survivor of a brutal family war, I was a rising star. My presentation, titled Resilient Leadership in Psychological Warfare Environments, had been met with a standing ovation. I hadn't used charts or graphs filled with impersonal data. I had used my story. I had taken the ugliest, most painful parts of my life and transformed them into lessons on integrity, resilience, and the true meaning of honor. My scars were no longer things to be hidden. They were my credentials. My pain had been forged into wisdom. After the presentation, as I was gathering my notes, a young female lieutenant approached me hesitantly. I recognized her immediately. She'd been a fresh second lieutenant in my company back at Lewis McChord. "Ma'am," she began, her eyes shining with an earnest intensity, "I just wanted to thank you. I was thinking about getting out of the Army next year. But then I saw what you went through, how you stood your ground and never compromised who you were. You made me realize that I could overcome anything too. You're the reason I decided to stay in." Her words hit me with a force that no enemy ever could. In that moment, I understood. My greatest victory wasn't in a courtroom in North Carolina. It wasn't in a settlement agreement or an exoneration email. It was here. It was in the determined eyes of this young officer. Later, I was approached by another familiar face. It was my cousin, Uncle Frank's daughter, now a confident young woman whom I hadn't seen in years. She threw her arms around me in a fierce hug. "I heard the whole story from my dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Amelie, because of you, I found the courage to leave my abusive husband. You showed me that I had the right to choose peace for myself. You saved me." I was stunned. I had been so focused on my own war, my own survival, that I never realized the ripples my battle had created. My fight for myself had inadvertently become a beacon for others, a small flame of defiance that had ignited courage in people I didn't even know were watching. My legacy wasn't something I needed to build. It was something that had been growing in the shadows all along. That evening, in the quiet of my temporary quarters, I opened the small sealed box I had carried with me from Fort Bragg. Inside lay the 2 silver captain's bars, symbols of my deepest humiliation, and my mother's hateful note. I picked them up. The sharp edges no longer felt painful. The hateful words were just ink on paper. They had lost their power over me. From my uniform case, I took out the polished gold oak leaves of my new rank, Major. I placed them on the desk, right next to the tarnished captain's bars. The old rank was not a symbol of shame anymore. It was a memorial. It was a reminder of the fire that had forged me, the battle that had defined me, and the victory that had freed me. It was a part of my story. Then I picked up the phone and called home. My real home. "Grandma, it's me," I said, a smile spreading across my face. Dorothy's voice came through the line, as warm and proud as ever. "I hear you knocked him dead out there in Kansas, Major," she chuckled. We talked for nearly an hour. We didn't speak of the past, of the Reeds, or of the war. We spoke of the future. Of my plans after graduation, of her upcoming visit. Our conversation was filled with easy laughter and an unconditional love that was as natural as breathing. This was my family. This was my truth. My story ends here, but my life is just beginning. It concludes with a simple, quiet image. It is me, Major Amelie Reed, standing in front of the mirror in my full dress uniform. The medals on my chest, the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, gleam under the light. But they are not the brightest things about me. The brightest thing is my reflection. I see a woman who is confident, not arrogant, a leader who has been tested by fire and emerged stronger, not harder. I see the living embodiment of the 7 Army values I swore to uphold: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. I don't just follow them anymore. I am them. And in my eyes, I see the reflection of a woman who fought her own demons and won. Not by destroying them, but by choosing to live a life so full of light, purpose, and peace that the darkness could never touch her again. A soldier, a leader, and finally a woman who is completely and utterly free. Thank you for walking with me through my story. My war for my own identity is over, but I know that for many of you, the battle is still very real. The greatest lesson I learned is that your true family are the people who lift you up, and your legacy is the strength you show in the face of the storm. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more stories of resilience that remind us we are not alone. And consider sharing this with just one person who needs to hear that their fight is worth it.